Canada pays tribute to its fallen soldiers. This monument represents a simple truth. They died so that we could be free.
Bullshit.
Free to pursue our dreams.
Bullshit.
Free to succeed
Bullshit.
or to fail and try again. Free to speak, to
Bullshit.
celebrate, to protest.
Bullshit.
Free to choose our leaders.
Bullshit.
Free to love whomever we want.
Bullshit.
Free to debate and refine our rights.
Bullshit.
We lost so many to the horrors of war. Tomorrow, just months away from celebrating 150 years of Canada, we pause to remember those who made our Canada
Bullshit,
possible.
bullshit, bullshit. What a great, steaming, stinking load of absolute fucking bullshit. Those brave young men and women weren't fighting for our freedom. They didn't pay the ultimate price to protect our country, our rights, or our liberties. North America was never in the slightest threatened by the world wars. Canada's involvement in those wars had nothing to do with freedom, good versus evil, or even right versus wrong. There was no moral imperative for our involvement in the cataclysm that was World War I. It had nothing to do with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, nationalism, or even hate. That war, and the war that followed it, was due to the inequity of the ruling elites, caused by their actions strictly for their fucking benefit. Now, I'm a bit of an iconoclast and a contrarian, so many of you might find what I have to say is hard to swallow. So don't take my word for it. Listen to what Canadian military historian Gwyn Dyer has to say.
Freedom is not at stake. The Germans are not going to be marching up Yonge Street. The British want to fight a war to maintain their position in the global pecking order. Fine, good luck to them. But it's not our war, and our kids are not going there.
That was an excerpt from an interview on the CBC's The Current from August 2014, the centenary of the start of World War I, or otherwise known as the War to End All Wars. And Gwyn Dyer dispels much of the sophistry around our involvement in those wars. He points out that those wars were unnecessary, pointless, didn't require our intervention, and we've been engaging in mass delusion ever since.
It was a century ago this week the British Empire marched into the First World War, and Canada marched along with it. 4 years later, Canada was less dependent on Britain. That war is often remembered as the baptism by fire that helped make modern Canada. Military historian Gwyn Dyer argues Canadians are prone to mythologizing about exactly what was won in those trenches. His new book, Canada in the Great Power Game, 1914-2014, follows our country through 2 world wars, the Cold War, and modern conflicts like Afghanistan, a century of battles that have killed thousands of Canadians. In none of those fights was there any serious threat to our territory or borders. He attempts to answer the big question, why does Canada fight? Gwyn Dyer joins me in our Toronto studio. Hello, and thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
So let's go back to 100 years ago this week. What was the national mood in Canada as war began?
Well, there was 2 national moods, obviously, as there always is. One's English, one's French. And the English-speaking Canada of 100 years ago was British Canada. I mean, there wasn't very many people in English-speaking Canada who were from even Ukraine, let alone India, or, now we're from everywhere. But then we were really British.
And yet, you talk about the other side. And one of the things that was interesting is I remember studying in high school the conscription crisis of the Second World War, but there was a similar crisis and conflict in the First World War.
In 1918, the Canadian Army was using machine guns on Canadian citizens in the streets of Quebec City in the anti-conscription riots because French Canadians didn't think it was their war. I mean, freedom is not at stake. The Germans are not going to be marching up Yonge Street. The British want to fight a war to maintain their position in the global pecking order. Fine, good luck to them. But it's not our war, and our kids are not going there. And when the casualties got so high that we brought in conscription to keep the army from basically just fading away in France because the casualties weren't being replaced, well, you couldn't just conscript English Canadians. You had to conscript French Canadians as well, and they didn't want to go.
But eventually they were forced?
They were forced, but we were saved by the bell. I mean, after the riots in the spring of Easter 1918, when 14 people were shot down in the streets of Quebec City, one of the very senior officers in the Canadian Army told the Prime Minister of the time, Sir Robert Borden, that if this war lasts another year, there may be a civil war in Canada. It didn't. It ended that November. But it was a fairly near-run thing. Could have broken this country.
Looking at the long view of this war, you have a very interesting and I think provocative take that caught me. We think of it as the First World War. Of course, at the time it was called the Great War, the war to end all wars. But in fact, you argue that it could be called World War V.
Yeah.
What are you getting at?
Well, what I'm getting at is that politically it wasn't anything new to have all the great powers go to war with each other in two rival alliances. In fact, this had been going on since the rise of centralized European states in about the 1600s, and there had been four major wars like this in the 16 and 17 and 1800s. And here comes another one. And if you look at it as a political phenomenon, it's absolutely familiar. What's different is the weapons and the wealth and the ability to mobilize millions of people and pay to arm them and feed them in the field and give them weapons that are machine weapons that kill really efficiently. And so the experience is totally different. And we think of it as a complete change in the way the world works. And the answer is it wasn't a change at all in the way the world works. It was a change in the technology and the resources. That's all.
And as you know, the toll was horrific. The number of Canadians per capita killed was huge. We think of it as the Great War. We wear poppies. I mean, all of us do out of respect. And yet, how much of it is because of the toll? Is it because we feel compelled to mythologize the sacrifice?
We lost so many people that we had to believe it was about something important.
And was it not? Is that
no,
what you're arguing?
No, it wasn't. Of course it will. I mean, unless you think being top dog in the international great power pecking order is important.
This was not like Hitler trying to take over all of Europe.
No, the Germans were outnumbered 2-1 all the way through the war. They were lucky to last as long as they did. And the idea that Germany was about to conquer anybody, they marched through Belgium to get around the French defenses on their border, but the French tried to invade Germany at exactly the same time, and so did the Russians.
Are you saying provocatively that it was a waste of life?
Of course I'm saying that, and it's not at all provocative. You only have to ask the soldiers who were there, and they'll tell you that, or they would when they were still with us. I've interviewed endless soldiers in this country and others from the First World War, and I have very rarely met one who said, yeah, that was worth doing.
Whereas in World War II, people would argue that.
But you see, the thing that actually happened in the First World War, because we lost so many people, 65,000 dead and 160,000 wounded, out of a population, English-speaking Canadian population of the time, that was about 5.5 million. I mean, that's an incredible toll. I mean, you'd have to quadruple it to get a sense of,
it's like losing a million people today.
36 million people.
Yeah.
It was 8 million then. It's like we lost 1 million people killed in Afghanistan in the last 4 years. How would you feel after that? And the answer is you'd have to feel this was about something important, because otherwise it's inconceivable that you would have wasted all those lives. So after the First World War, we were compelled to go on doing the same thing, because otherwise you would be betraying the dead. It's loyalty to our own losses, our own casualties. We have to believe that Flanders fields and so on was a worthwhile sacrifice, because if it wasn't, what did we do to those young men? And if you didn't go off and do it again in 1939 and in the Cold War and in Afghanistan and so on, then somehow you're suggesting, and you might be right to suggest, but it's very painful, that a lot of this was a waste of life.
So when you now look with through the prism of 100 years, was it a different country in 1918 than it was in 1914 because of its involvement in the war?
Very much so. I think very much so. I mean, there was a transformation, the idea that, somebody, I think the Prime Minister was saying the other day, our identity was forged in the trenches of the First World War. Well, no, we knew we were Canadian before that. The name had been around for a while. But in the sense that we were, in some ways, a national enterprise that did large collective things together. That's, together with the Transcontinental Railway, the first large thing we did together. And it was a whole lot more emotional than building a railway. So, yeah, in that sense, our identity comes from there. Not French-Canadian identity. You get a real divergence of identities here, and it's never really closed again.
When you look back, was Canada fighting with Britain or for Britain?
Oh, I think it was fighting for Britain. I mean, what we didn't have a dog in that fight, or we shouldn't have had. I mean, what was it about that was of importance to Canada? It wouldn't have made much difference if Germany had won, frankly. It wouldn't have made much difference to anybody if Germany had won. It would have won by the skin of its teeth. It couldn't have imposed a harsh peace. It wasn't out to conquer the world, and it certainly couldn't. I mean, 80 million Germans, how are they going to conquer the world? Or even Europe?
Well, Hitler certainly tried
Hitler
effectively
got
in the
away
Second
with
World
it
War.
for a couple of years because he had a little bit of a technological edge until the Russians came in, and he was always going to fight the Russians in the end, and the Russians tore him to pieces. Hitler, just like the First World War Germans, although they were not in the First World War more aggressive than anybody else, but in both wars, they couldn't possibly be the kind of threat we portrayed them as. There just wasn't enough of them.
But getting back to the point about whether Canada was a proxy for Britain,
Yeah.
You write about how Britain, in many ways, hoodwinked Canada into an alliance.
Oh, yeah. Well, they did know that they were going to need colonial manpower. I mean, by the turn of the 20th century, it was clear to Britain that it could no longer sort of be this superpower offshore island that didn't have to get involved in little European squabbles, which had been the position through most of the 19th century, first country on the planet to industrialize. Now they're going to have to get down and dirty and fight for their corner. And there's only, at that point, 34 million of them, but there's 10 million more, white troops or people who would produce European-style troops in the colonies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So we need to get them used to the idea of fighting in European wars. Canadian troops had never gone overseas, but between 1900 and 1914, the British actually, you can see the correspondence in the diplomatic stuff, are busily shaping the Canadian militia, training Canadian soldiers, and working on Canadian public opinion and official opinion because they know they're going to need our soldiers whenever it comes. 1914 is when it happened to come.
Canada's Minister of Militia and Defence in the war was Sam Hughes. Tell us a little bit about Sam Hughes.
Sam Hughes was a good old boy. I mean, that he was your classic. You think of them as Southern politicians, sort of, how do you build your political empire? And the answer is you get people jobs. It's all about patronage. And Sam Hughes built a political career on being the Minister of Militia and passing out jobs to his friends. He ran the Canadian military for about 20 years. And frankly, he did have corrupt friends. I don't think he ever personally enriched himself, but obviously there's lots of corrupt people around him. But basically, he was a megalomaniac, and a megalomaniac with huge power because of his ability to hand out jobs. I think a lot of Canadian troops in the First World War died because of him, because we sent our troops over with equipment that was inadequate or inappropriate. He kept trying to sort of parachute his cronies into command positions in combat. And, when you put amateurs in command, people die.
So was he incompetent?
He was, yes, he was incompetent militarily. He had an attitude which was commonplace in the Canadian militia at the time, which is that the professional soldiers are dull and dim-witted and driven, whereas this imaginative spark of the Canadian militiaman will sort of every day, every time outshine the dull, plodding efforts of the professional. Well, I'm sorry, professional soldiers are good at their trade because they've spent a long time studying and practicing it. And he did not do that. He was a militiaman. And so I think he was responsible for a lot of casualties.
So how do we reconcile? You're exploding a lot of myths about Canada's involvement in the First World War. How do we reconcile that with the notion of valor that the Canadians fought with in the war? Can we still believe in that?
Oh, the courage, the sacrifice are real. I would ban the use of the word warrior. I hate it. I mean, all of that poetic vocabulary, warriors fall in combat. No, I'm sorry, young men die. Don't let's dress it up in those words, because otherwise you don't understand what you're ordering people to do, and you sort of it all wafts off on a cloud of poetry. No, the sacrifice is real. The courage is real. The loss is terrible. But it doesn't mean that the goal or the objective is legitimate, let alone worth those lives. I mean, the guys on the other side were brave too, and they died, and, so you can't assume that this all goes together. Courage doesn't mean right.
But I'm a little confused here. Do you think really, given the politics of 100 years ago, Canada could have said no?
No, it could not have said no because of the Canadian population 100 years ago. English Canadian population was essentially British.
So they were going to stand by their...
They would stand by the mother country. So we got into this because of the composition of our population at that time, which was radically different from what it is now, of course. And yet the sacrifices that those young men made have, in a way, tied us ever after to going to any great power war that comes along, because we are part of this process that allegedly, in our own mythology, somehow saves the world from tyranny and conquest. I mean, it's really quite striking that even the Americans, who have subsequently become a great power and been sucked into the game, didn't go into either war when we did. I mean, the two
Americans entered, 1917?
1917. Well, they didn't come into the Second World War for 2 years either. The two world wars lasted, the real, 1914, 18, 1939 to 45, 10 years. The Americans were in them for 5. We were in them for 10. We don't know where we live.
Well, it brings up an interesting point, which you also addressed, which is that here was Canada, this emerging colony, engaging itself in wars that in no way directly threatened its own sovereignty, its own security.
No threat at all. No, we did it out of loyalty to Britain in the beginning, and then as the sacrifices mounted, we did it out of the same kinds of mythologized reasoning that the British themselves use, which is that we are, protecting small nations, defending the right of neutrality, stopping German militarism, preventing the conquest of Europe by the evil militaristic Germans. All nonsense.
Just this week, Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister, said, as he was laying a wreath, that this war set the stage for us to defending our neighbors and those who, I think he was paraphrasing, but something, sharing our values.
Yeah, I mean, which of our values I would love to know. I mean, first of all, Germany was probably slightly more democratic than Britain in 1914. I mean, all German males had the vote. Only about 70% of British ones did. So just to be clear here, from your perspective, what was Germany after in this war? Germany was I think this was a classic case of nobody's after anything in particular. I mean, there's a book been published recently called The Sleepwalkers about the way that Europe went into the First World War. And I think it's a quite appropriate phrase because while they lived within a context where they knew that great power wars would happen from time to time, and they prepared for those wars because there was all these other ones in the background there in the history, they had nothing in particular to fight about in 1914 except the threat that if they didn't fight now, they might be in a weaker position later, or the need to safeguard their position in the pecking order. If you look at what the British told themselves in 1914, and they weren't threatened, their borders weren't threatened either. And they told themselves that in order to maintain our position, to prevent the emergence of any rival power in Europe, we must fight now.
And you engage in a little bit of sort of counterfactual history in the book, including how things might have turned out had Germany won.
In the First World War?
Yeah.
No worse than they did. Probably a little bit better, frankly, because if Germany had won, it would have won barely by the skin of its teeth, and it would have had to make a quick and very generous peace because, otherwise it couldn't hang on. And that might have been a more durable peace than the one we imposed when we wrote the Treaty of Versailles, which basically made World War II inevitable because we treated the defeated powers so brutally and made them admit what was not true, which was that it was all their fault.
As you write history, how do you think Canadians should remember World War I?
Canadians should remember World War I. If I were... Well, I suppose I do write history, but if I were writing history that people had to read and believe, which I think probably would be dangerous, I would say that it is an excellent example of how you can talk yourselves into untenable positions that do great damage. This is not a war that we were needed in. It wouldn't have come out any differently if we hadn't been in it. It killed a generation, killed or injured a generation of English Canadians, and it lumbered us with an ideology of how we fight for freedom and so on, in all continents, which has dragged us into subsequent conflicts that we also shouldn't have been in. I mean, we talk about troops in Afghanistan defending freedom. Whose freedom? Ours?
It sure goes counter to the lest we forget and wearing poppies every November 11th, to all of the mythology that we've been taught over these generations.
Well, I think that is, yes, it does run counter to that without being disrespectful or forgetful of the sacrifice that the soldiers made. I think that needs to be recalled, remembered. But I have different reasons for wanting to remember it than making sure we do it again.
Gwynne Dyer, thank you.
You're welcome.
Journalist and military historian Gwynne Dyer joined us in Toronto. His new book is Canada in the Great Power Game, 1914-2014.